And furthermore, Mario is the official cultural attaché of the Kansas City Chiefs. It's a little bit out of focus this morning, but I think he'll rejoin us shortly. And Stephanie, did you ever, in fact, take the boredom course? You're muted. Got to get your sound up.
Where are you actually now, James and Mario and Stephanie?
That's a question we keep asking ourselves.
Yes.
Mario's in Kansas.
Okay, KC, Mario?
Kansas City, yeah.
All right.
And I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay.
La ciudad de Los Ángeles Casi Perdidos, the city of almost lost angels. And Stephanie oftentimes is in Armenia, but she's not there right now.
All right, I'm sorry about that. My computer, I think it's time to get a new one. It just doesn't register the sound anymore with the microphone. Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, beautiful. I'm very sorry about that.
And Professor Gary, you're in Indiana.
Yes, Valparaiso, the Valley of Paradise.
Yeah.
Valparaiso.
What is that?
See.
Croatian? Is that the Croatian term for it?
No, it was named by a Spaniard. Yeah, they came through and just saw this beautiful valley and named it.
Well, all right. Thank you for joining us. Now, our MO is conversational.
Mm-hmm.
And any infelicities can be excised by our peripatetic producer, Sebastian Mahfoud. And we have a set of questions, but we don't have to take them in any special order. We usually at least get started in that way. And I'm about to begin. And so I'll count down as I usually do from 3 5/7. Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes, official philosopher for the Kansas City Chiefs. Today, we discuss the puzzling phenomenon of boredom. Today, we discuss the phenomenon of boredom. We're especially interested in its effects on education. Our special guest is Kevin Hood Gary, a professor of education at Valparaiso University. He is the co-founder of the North American Association for the Philosophy of Education. The association provides a forum for scholars working at the intersection of philosophy and educational theory. Professor Gary is the author of Why Boredom Matters: Education, Leisure, and the Quest for a Meaningful Life, Cambridge, 2022, just last year. We are also graced by the presence of Stephanie Havens, Executive Director at Christians in Need Foundation. And though she has rarely, if ever, been bored,
yeah, I can't say that. Thank you.
She has watched others who have languished in that condition, especially with the guidance of the not late but continuously great Siobhan Nash Marshall, who has oftentimes shared her thoughts on boredom, but only rarely used a cattle prod to motivate her students. Now, as always, we begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Professor Gary, Kevin, if we may, could you please tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to the Valley of Paradise, which is to say Valparaiso University?
I'm happy to. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you. So I have been at Valparaiso now this is my 9th year. I'm a military brat by upbringing, lived in lots of different places, grew up in a Catholic home, and ended up going to the University of Notre Dame for undergraduate, and was cursed with an obsession with their football team, which has lasted to this day. At Notre Dame, I studied political philosophy and was pre-med, and eventually ended up, after graduating, not going to medical school, but entering the seminary at Notre Dame. And so was in the seminary for 4 years. And really, it was during my novitiate year, which is a kind of a monastic year in formation, where the questions that I address in the book really became very clear to me, especially as I was trying to pray and to be still and to be with God in a community of brothers there. I ended up then getting a PhD at Loyola University Chicago, and I was also teaching at Loyola Academy, a Jesuit school just outside of Chicago. And my doctoral work was in philosophy of education. And I was actually drawn to Soren Kierkegaard, who's this hybrid of philosophy, theology, and literature. And so had a tough time choosing one discipline, and so found perhaps one of the most interdisciplinary thinkers around. I ended up getting to higher ed then. My first job was at Goshen College, and I've had the privilege of teaching in a variety of different areas. I teach here at Valparaiso in education, but also in theology. And then we have an honors college here that I get to teach in. It's a great books program as well. So that's a brief overview of where I've been and where I am right now.
Well, as a one-time domer, did you at least hear rumors of a fellow named Ralph McInerney?
I did. I actually had a course with Ralph McInerney on Kierkegaard and Newman. And
I guess he was a candidate to come to Notre Dame because of his interest in Kierkegaard.
That's right. Yeah. And just an incredible writer. And he was a wonderful teacher. I mean, he would just kind of literally stroll into the classroom, and I don't think he even had notes. He could just talk, and it was just illuminating, fascinating, and very kind of conversational. And he made it very accessible. The kind of the opaque ideas of Kierkegaard and even Newman, he made it very clear and engaging.
All right. Well, that's a very helpful intro. Mario, you want to take us forward?
Well, the first time that I read your bio and you wrote about boredom, it caught my attention. So my first question is, what is boredom?
Thank you. It's funny when I share with people, I was writing a book on boredom. The response that I would almost universally hear was, "Wow, that's really interesting." which boredom is simply defined as a state of disinterest. It's there's different kinds of boredom. The most common version that we're aware of is situational boredom. So I'm in a situation and I don't find anything meaningful or engaging in the environment. We tend to think about it objectively. I'm bored by this class I'm taking, this book I'm reading, this person I'm speaking with, but actually it's both subjective and objective. So we're reading our environment and we're making a judgment, an assessment about whether there's anything meaningful or engaging going on. And I think that's really important because boredom reveals something about our environment, but it also reveals something about ourselves. And we know that, what I might find boring, someone else could find very interesting. And so in that respect, boredom is kind of a complex mood state. We tend to trust it implicitly. Students will write things off quite judgmentally and even moralistically. That's boring. We know that if given time, you might find there's actually something very meaningful here. And so boredom is, back to your question, is simply defined as a state of disinterest, in our environment.
So,
That gets us situated. Go ahead, Mario.
so our interest is inclined to enjoy certain aspect of life, certain themes, certain topics, but very often that interest is driven by our biology, our way of how we are wired. In other words, some people in class, I found, they are not very interested in what I'm talking about. It's not because the topic, is because they have low thyroid function. So in other words, it's not just a question of the state of mind, it's something else. How do you explain that? Is something, quote unquote, spiritual, psychological, physical, all the above? Which one is it?
Well, you're absolutely right that our physiology, literally, if we're physically tired, we're more prone to boredom. And when we're bored, the bored state is prone to losing attention and moving from one thing to the next to find something that engages or piques our attention. And so when we're physically exhausted, we're much more vulnerable to the bored state. And so I do think there's a biological aspect there. But at the same time, I think there's also a spiritual aspect. The word boredom is only about 300 years old. The precursors of boredom, in France, the word melancholy and the Enlightenment was trying to understand boredom biologically, as literally the word melancholy translates as black bile. There was this thought that this boredom is this substance in my physiology that's causing this mood state. We've since moved on from that, but there was an impulse to reduce it to just a biological explanation. And, I think the word boredom was almost a humbler stepping back from that biological reductionism. Going back further in the Catholic Orthodox tradition, the concept of acedia or acadia, it's sometimes pronounced, that Evagrius talks about, which is, really trying to understand it as a spiritual malaise. It's not simply I'm tired or I'm hungry. It's that there's something spiritually amiss, and it's a demon that it was called the noonday devil. And the reason why it's called the noonday devil is it comes at you unawares. I mean, in broad daylight. We think of nighttime and the horrors of night, and that's when demons are prowling. The noonday devil, it comes at us in the midst of very ordinary activities, and is trying to stir up a weariness and an aimlessness and a fatigue with very simple things. And so, to your point, Mario, I think it's both biological and spiritual. And I think if there's a tendency to reduce it to either one, I think we're going to misunderstand. We might be bored, and maybe in fact we do just need to take a nap so that we can wake up renewed and then attend to something meaningfully. I find when I go on retreats and I go on a silent retreat, I just all of a sudden feel so tired. And it's really just giving my body permission to attend to its fatigue, and so needing to kind of to settle with that. That's a long answer to your very short question, Mario. So let me pause there.
Thank you.
In reading your book, Kevin, I found myself thinking of a book that really made an impact on me in the 60s. It was written by an anarchist thinker, Paul Goodman, and the title was Growing Up Absurd. And in this book, Goodman made a lot of connections between education and what we're getting educated for. And then by way of easy and natural transition, for me at any rate, I thought about how I always enjoyed reading Dilbert, the Dilbert cartoon. And now I want to ask Stephanie to ask you, about how boredom might be part of our growing up, because we grow up to be bored.
Yes.
Or something like that. But put that in your own better words, please.
Happily, because you were very flattering to suggest that I have never been bored, but you can see that I'm very young. It's not a fair assessment. I think I can speak to the younger side, boredom for the younger side, but then also what we were already speaking about, because I'm a mother of two.
Ah, never bored. Always tired, never bored.
But those times where there's a little bit of quiet. Oh, I'm sorry, baby's outside. I'll close the window. I live in a shared building. I'm in Italy right now, and it's a renovated 18th century monastery.
It gets more interesting as it goes along.
Yes, but sometimes the children come out, there's always something new. In fact, one of them is waving, hello. I never know these things are coming. They're always coming at me. But for example, those moments where I just have a little bit of peace and quiet, and then my mind just starts to go. So to that one, I understand that one. But I remember very distinctly when I was young, when I was in high school, and I didn't have a lot of structure from my parents. I didn't have a lot of structure from my schooling. And so I remember very, very distinctly, especially in the summers when school was out and my routine was broken, the thing that I would do was I'd get up in the morning, I would get something to eat, and then I would spend the rest of the day in front of the TV. I would go downstairs where there was nobody. I would spend the rest of the time in front of the TV.
A lot of great shows, huh?
No, I watched Judge Judy. No, I remember very distinctly, it was a way for me to pass the time, because yes, there's a problem of habits. Those habits weren't checked with me, but I think I see a layer of problems. There were the habits, there was perhaps physical issues that I had, maybe they were present, but I didn't see a greater purpose for myself. I didn't think that, and I mean, my parents brought me up Catholic, which is the mysterious thing. My parents are Catholic. I went to church every Sunday. But in my mind, I didn't understand it as I'm here for a purpose, I'm here for a reason, therefore the things that I do matter. It's kind of like I was just spending my time until it was over. And I think this is what many of us are experiencing right now. So to your points, I think it's a multifaceted problem, especially with the young. I think with the young, the heart of the problem, of course, the habits don't help and the physical issues don't help. But I think oftentimes the heart of it is they either don't recognize God's place in their lives, or they don't, but what stems from that, the lack of purpose stems from that, because the purpose has to be something outside of something that I make up. Otherwise, I'm nauseous before the possibilities of things that I could do and I could be. And that's not something that secures me, but something that makes me very overwhelmed, very scared. So yes, that was my experience of boredom. And I personally found Kevin, your book, very helpful. Also because I hope to be a teacher, but also just as a mom, and trying to think through like those days where I lose my patience and I just want to maybe crawl back into bed. How to remember what I care about, to reconnect with things.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that's I really appreciate the personal story of watching Judge Judy. I can identify with that, and we now have a much more extreme version of that. Walker Percy, the great Catholic writer, described modern life as a sophisticated boredom avoidance scheme, and the scheme has gotten way more sophisticated with smartphones and just the endless amusement and distraction. And so the kind of I used to do with my kids when they were younger, technology fast weekends where I would forbid any screen activity, and inevitably there would be complaints, there'd be grumbling.
Yes, of course.
And then there was always this moment of, Dad, I'm so bored, there's nothing to do. And there are kind of two things going on there. The one is really a lack of imagination. I just cannot see anything meaningful, worthwhile to do. And really a demand that I hand them something, or that I find a way to keep them entertained. Parents now, on road trips are increasingly fraught trips when screens don't work. They need to have the screens powered up so the kids can be. And when we think about road trips, when I was traveling across the country with my family in 1981, it really was sitting with your thoughts and looking out the window and letting your mind go where it will. And going back to my kids, inevitably that first extinction burst of, we don't get to watch TV this morning, turned into creativity. They began to create forts. They began to actually find internal resources for contending with this mood state. In some ways, even the label is problematic, because once you've named boredom, it's your body, your mind is working something out. And once we've named it, we're kind of looking outward for a solution, rather than trusting that if we're patient with it, we're going to find a creative solution to it.
That's important. Mario, what next here?
Well, I have a few questions, but I'm not sure that I want to ask those questions. But
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think, Gary, you said something in passing that caught my attention. You said Orthodox Catholics. And my experience has been that before I was, quote, an Orthodox Catholic, I was the first one who, in my family. I remember having been, I don't know, it's bored or kind of despair. When I found many years ago the faith, I become enthusiastic with a lot of energy my whole life, because it was as if my reason was grasp truth. And that was what I was pursuing my whole life, even though through a lot of limitations and poverty and you name it. Now, what sometimes happened to me, and I heard some people the same, is that when I hear many people in the church question truth that for me are settled today, and these are part of the hierarchy. And listen, also some people say, well, that was not that important anyway. It seems that kind of air of lack of interest is coming into my spirit, because, hey, I gave my life to this. Now everything seems to be up for grabs. So what is the point? So what is my point? My point is that if there's no truth, there is boredom is gonna be the state of mind anyway. Now, here I think one of the points is that truth is given also within a community, and if within the church become less and less orthodox, then we are going to become more and more bored, if you will. And then look at the neighbor, how the neighbor is doing in order to find something that satisfies my heart. And so, and that's not an easy place to be. So I can go on and on, but I think that's the how truth play in this sense of meaning that we have in order to have something that will not bore us our whole life. I don't know if it makes sense what I said, but I don't want to touch names or that, but
that makes a lot of sense, Mario. And I think what you're getting at is existential boredom. So there's situational boredom where I'm bored with this particular, book I'm reading, but situational boredom, and Heidegger, actually, the philosopher, helps make this distinction, is a profound loss of meaning, that there's just no meaning ultimately. And so the bored state, it quickly moves from just a passing mood state to a much more profound metaphysical kind of commentary on the universe as utterly disenchanted. And I think part of a Catholic worldview, and I'm thinking with Tolkien and the great writer C.S. Lewis, is what they help us realize is that the world is enchanted. Our lives are, are graced. Towards the end of the book, I bring up George Bernanot's Diary of a Country Priest, and he makes this, observation about how bored people are. And I think what he's getting at is a loss or a disenchantment, this loss of really attending to how God is working in the world. Flannery O'Connor is one of my favorite writers, and I love her writing because she begins oftentimes in spaces that just seem really barren and just God-forsaken. Her short story Revelation actually begins in the waiting room of a doctor's office, which is not a place where you really want to spend a lot of time. You usually want it to be short and get through it. And it's this bleak situation, and it's overcrowded, and there's a plastic fern. I mean, it just feels just utterly bereft. And yet, for the main character, Ruby Turpin, it becomes this incredible occasion for a very difficult grace that she receives. And so O'Connor is also a writer that helps us recognize how enchanted the world is. The bored mind and the profoundly bored mind is kind of, sadly can be really disenchanted, and that's a very sad place to be. In the book, I actually talk about the movie Groundhog Day, which, I find the character to be quite despicable, but the trajectory of his movement from being utterly, in utter despair to beginning to find meaning in the same day that's repeating itself over and over and over again, I think is thinking with this move from being a bored person to a person who's actually open to grace and the world being charged with the grandeur of God, to quote Gerard Manley Hopkins.
When I think of waiting rooms, and that Revelation story is just terrific. In contemporary culture, medical waiting room number one is Doc Martin's waiting room, where Norwenna is directing the traffic, and one thing after another goes on there. I wonder, though, if you could, getting back to philosophy, do a little compare and contrast for us. Your man Kierkegaard versus Arthur Schopenhauer, who called attention to, and this connects with Stephanie, the hideous boredom of a Sunday afternoon, the crushing boredom of a Sunday afternoon. Of course, we deal with that by football, but any thoughts there?
That's a great question. So I turned to Kierkegaard because his authorship, he writes in pseudonyms, and then he also writes a veronymous authorship in his own name, and he's writing both of these authorships during the same time, and throughout his entire incredible production of texts. The first major text was Either Or, and the main character writing that, the voice, is the aesthete, and this is someone who's profoundly bored with life and trying to find strategies for how to cope with boredom. And I would say the aesthete's response is really just trying to pursue pleasure in all of its myriad forms, an endless pursuit of pleasure. And Kierkegaard diagnoses the aesthete as ultimately a person in despair. They're really a self in despair. Kierkegaard has this really complex definition of a self as this as this attempt to hold together these two, excuse me, wings of ourselves, possibility on the one hand and necessity on the other. And we fall into despair when we veer towards necessity or we veer towards possibility. And what he means by that, by necessity, he means, you know, we are situated, we have certain givens. I'm not going to be a professional basketball player. That's just a fundamental necessity that I've had to accept. And, you know, we can let that be a form of despair. You know, my necessities are so overwhelming, they're so pronounced, I'm so defined by my genetics and my environment that I fall into the despair of necessity, as Kierkegaard describes it. Inversely, the despair of possibility is we're thinking about possibilities all the time, but rather than thinking about possibilities that are real and possible for us, we tend to get preoccupied with other possibilities. We tend to fixate on the possibilities of other people. And this is where social media, I think, has amplified. You know, we're such voyeurs of other people's lives. We're fascinated by other people's lives. There's you know, and there's so much, there's so many great television shows now where we're watching other possibilities, other people's possibilities. And Kierkegaard finds that to be also a form of despair, because rather than thinking about something that's possible for us and actually bringing it into being, we're sort of staying in this kind of fantasy world on the one hand, or we're stuck in this despair of necessity that kind of throws its arms up and say that there's really nothing I can do here. And so the two kinds of responses to boredom kind of map onto this. One response is resignation. As a teacher of teachers, I get to visit a lot of classrooms, and oftentimes I see amazing teaching going on. But sometimes I see really boring classes, and usually the students misbehave. Usually there's problems there. I was a high school teacher, and if my students were getting bored, I was going to have some misbehavior problems. But sometimes I don't see misbehavior. I see students that are compliant, that are sitting there. One time I was visiting a 7th grade class, and the students were tasked with just copying a PowerPoint down word for word for the entire class period. It was very boring. And I turned to one of the students and I said, is this kind of a typical day? And the student said to me with a sigh, we do this every day. And what amazed me was the students were not, they weren't causing problems. They weren't agitating. They were just resigned. They were just accepting this condition. And so I think that's a real problem. That's a version of the despair of necessity. The despair of possibility maps onto, you know, we can never sit still with one thing. We're constantly avoiding and moving on to something else. And so that's where, you know, Kierkegaard's despair maps on. So, you know, I think Kierkegaard is a really helpful source to help us think through kind of the deeper levels that are going on here.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. What thoughts and what cures or what therapies? I know that Professor Gary's sister is a psychiatrist, and so he must know something about therapies.
Yes.
And I myself am seriously neurotic, so I'm always looking for therapies.
Well, I need help myself. I think we all do. None of us have the whole story. It's why we need each other. It's why we need God. But to the first point, in response to what Kevin was saying, at the point in your book where you were talking about, you were starting on Kierkegaard, and you said specifically this: poet A does not simply render judgment about his own condition. So when he's talking about himself and his methods for dealing with boredom, he's not just talking about himself. He's also talking about the nature, his understanding. He's passed a judgment about the meaning of life itself. So to go back to my point earlier, when I was younger, there were the habits, of course, and I know I can see it in my life. I'm still fighting with these habits. I can give you a very concrete example. I think it might be a common example for kids. When I was younger, when I changed my clothes, I got into my pajamas at the end of the day, I would take my clothes and I would throw them on my chair. And then it would go on and go on. And so there'd be a little pile of clothes by the end of each week on my chair. Now, if I'm not careful, I still do that. If I'm not, and I have to be very aware about it. So where my habits were good, I don't have to think about them as much, but where my habits need correction, I have to be very intentional. So I see with myself still these habits resurfacing. So part of that is fighting habits, which, okay, but the heart of it was that I couldn't see purpose in my life. What was underneath my boredom, this detachment from what was in front of me, my detachment from my life, my detachment from reality and seeing the good in reality, at the heart of it was an inability to see God, to see my purpose aligned through him. And then you can deal with that in one of the two ways. I think you see it in the kids too, as Kevin was saying. Some of them lean towards just kind of being resigned, like I'm here until it's over, like me in front of Judge Judy every day over the summer. Or the kids who are, I've heard this, someone that I knew in college believed that they could do anything that they wanted, but he was so kind of caught up in the ideas of what he could be, he never really did anything, to put it that way. And then, so you see both. For me, one of the main things that really helped me was actually having somebody outside of myself. So in the book, it's also mentioned the importance of a teacher. And so for me, that was as you mentioned, was Professor Dr. Nash Marshall. And she was crucial. Now, she couldn't fix my habits for me. She could give me advice also with the habits, and she has, and that's key as well. But the first thing that she did for me was that she saw something in me that was the most striking thing about her. I was so used to teachers. I mean, some of them didn't care about me. I wouldn't go so far as it's not so bleak as to say that teachers don't care about their students. They do. But I remember very distinctly that she approached me. She wanted to know me, just randomly out of the blue. She came to me after class. She said, "You're going to major in philosophy. I like you." I was like, "What?" I thought she was crazy. I thought that she didn't realize who I was. And I told her, "No, I'm majoring in English. I think you have me confused with somebody else." She goes, "No, I don't have you confused with somebody else. You're majoring in philosophy. Go get the paperwork done." And I did. So the first striking thing was that she saw something in me. She approached me. She saw purpose in me. And then through her guidance, through her correction, I could start, it gave me a structure through which I could see the meaning in my life. And then I wanted to live. And then the rest comes, the desire to change my habits, the desires to fight the physical things that I have to deal with, everything. So for the young, I mean, and also we're Catholics. I think the first step is to be the salt of the earth. I don't know how else to put it. Is be the thing that they can't find anywhere else. The genuine love, the genuine care that they can't find anywhere else. The connection to reality that they can't seem to find anywhere else. I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. I think that a couple things going on there with your teacher. Where was this, by the way? Where were you studying?
This was Manhattanville College.
Okay.
That's in New York City.
Yes. I think you can imagine a young person seeing, my son plays the violin, and I could see him, seeing a master virtuoso playing the violin and just being moved and inspired by that. And I think there's almost an epiphany. You see something that is intrinsically beautiful and valuable, and you're moved by that. However, to get to that level of craftsmanship at anything requires being an apprentice, and it also requires kind of pushing through the malaise and the lulls that will come with learning anything. Getting good at anything requires pushing through the boredom state. And I think this is where apprenticeship is so important, where you have, I think good teachers are able to guide students into areas of inquiry that are intrinsically, valuable and beautiful, but the students may not see that. And what they need to do is, there needs to be a relationship of trust where a mentor is saying, trust me, you're not seeing this now, but if you stay with this and you do the work, you're going to experience the intrinsic value of creating music or speaking a new language or understanding algebra. And so, but that goes also back then to habits. You can have the vision, but if you don't have the habits set up in place, and this is so wonderful, I find this in the Platonic dialogue, Socrates is incredible about drawing an interlocutor to a moment where they see an image of virtue and they're like, oh my gosh, that's the person I want to be. And then Socrates basically says, yeah, but now you need to rehabituate yourself. Your habits are completely distorted. And if you don't set up a situation, and really what he means, I think, is a community of people that are going to help us get rehabituated, it will just be a passing, epiphany that doesn't really kind of take hold in our lives. And so I think that's really important. In terms of the cure, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I think cultivating a Sabbath leisure is what I contend is the way we push back against the bored state. And we have a lot of resources in the Catholic tradition on that. In the text, I draw quite a bit on Joseph Pieper's wonderful book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, as a way to respond to the bored state.
Mario, what next?
Well, following, I think, about the teaching aspect. You were mentioned, Gary, that there are times that teachers are boring, at least the method they implement, and I agree with that. But I wonder that is related to how that teacher, let's say in philosophy, understand philosophy. If philosophy is just a set of propositions, which has nothing to do with life, of course, they are going to pass on this proposition. You learn by copying from the board or repeating them, and that's it. In other words, they lack what Kierkegaard said, subjective truth. In other words, when you appropriate, you embrace, and that changes your own life as a teacher. Therefore, then when you teach your life. You don't teach proposition. This is what I live by, and this is the meaning of my life. And then you are passing on something else, your own humanity. So it's not as much as, I think it's a method rather than how then we find meaning in what we do. And I think that's key. And that lead me to something Stephanie was saying. And for me, I have no answer. And which is happening, I'm observing lately, to some millennials who are in their 30s or early 30s, which is the following. They get bored at their work, even though they have degrees. And the other day, one young gentleman came to me and said, well, I'm quitting. And he's working in a company and he's making decent money. And it's a decent company. And he said, well, I'm overwhelmed here. I want to be happy. I want to find a place where I can realize, fulfill myself. And okay. And I said inside of me, well, good luck. If you are going to find this paradise in where you are going to fulfill everything, I don't think you are going to find. That's I didn't say, but I thought. And I said, well, when I was growing up, that was off the table. You embrace something, you have a vocation for something, and then life was very hard. Even though you cannot even live as a philosopher when I was growing up, you had to work in something else. So why is that happening, this divorce, if you will, between what you are and the reality? Sometimes it's hard if we don't want to accept that, or we expect something beautiful to come. I don't know if you have some reaction to that.
I do. So just there were a number of points there, Mario, that you were getting at. The first was teachers that are boring, and partly I'm challenging the student, response, blaming boredom on their environment, and so I think the challenge is to turn it back on the student and say, no, you actually have a role in this, in this problem. However, teachers also do have a responsibility to find ways to introduce their subjects in ways that are meaningful. When students do not see meaning and they're not understanding, boredom is close behind. And so good teachers are trying to find creative hooks and ways to draw students in. However, I do think teaching can become a version of edutopia or edutainment, not edutopia, edutainment, where we're trying to constantly outrun boredom. And let me show you this clip. Let me do that. Go to your Chromebook. Now open your iPad, which I think has been a real problem in education because the way out of boredom is simply attention, deep attention to things that are intrinsically valuable. And so teachers are guiding students to that. And that requires creativity, but also challenging students and also naming that boredom will come. It's something that we're going to have to contend with. We tend to just not even talk about it and just try to avoid it and outrun it. On a related note, I think, in thinking about church and boredom, you mentioned that you teach not your propositions, but you teach your personality. And I think that's true. But for some reason, I was thinking about homilies that I find boring, sermons that I find boring.
What? That happens.
And generally, I've noticed that I get bored when the priest talks about himself. A new priest at a new parish can do that for the first couple of months. But then the turn should always be to the gospel, to the readings. You're pushing the word of God. And too often I find that gets lost. And instead we get an anecdote about what happened this weekend or this week, or when I was 8 or 9. And that I confess, maybe I need to repent of this. Maybe I need to go to confession. I find that boring because we have this incredible text. We have the revealed word of God, which the Catholic philosopher Jean-Luc Marion describes as a saturated phenomena. We can read the story of the prodigal son again and again and again and never get bored by it. It's always revealing something to us. It's overwhelming in what it's telling and teaching us. And so I think we need to, and teachers too, what they're pointing to is not themselves. They're pointing to the beauty and the saturated phenomena of biology or physics or chemistry or history. And so that needs to be at the center as we're moving past the bored state. To your point about work, though, I think that's a really good point because, there are some dreadful jobs. I think about the person when I go through the tollway who's handing out a ticket to cars, and doing that for 8 hours a day. I mean, having, a 3-second interaction with another human being where you're collecting money and handing them, so they can go through the toll. I think, finding that work boring is justified. And I think we need to sometimes rethink some of the conditions on the ground that can draw us into the bored state and thinking about that carefully. In education 100 years ago, one of the objectives in this report, the Cardinal Secondary Education Report, was the cultivation of leisure. And that didn't just mean going on a vacation. That meant bringing a spirit of leisure to study and to work. And that's something that schools, we don't talk about. And I think the problem with that is the cultivation of noble forms of leisure is privatized. That's something we all have to figure out on our own. And perhaps we have churches that awaken us and guide us into that. But most often, I think what happens is the market fills that void, and it provides all kinds of amusement and distraction to take care of our longing for leisure. And so that to me is a real concern.
Do you know, at this point of the show, and Mario will confirm this, I sometimes offer a rant. But you folks are fortunate, because I'm going to offer a story, and it's even true. It's even true. And it bears on mentors, methods, and alternatives. Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, was once upon a time prevailed on by James Boswell to travel to the continent. Well, Johnson didn't think there was much point, but he gave in. Then lo and behold, he found himself there with Boswell, having a chat with Voltaire. And the chat had to be in Latin. And after a time, Voltaire said to him, I can't say it in Latin, but Voltaire said it in Latin, "Why, sir, your Latin is exemplary." And Johnson said, "Indeed, my master beat me very well. And in beating me, he said, 'This I do to save you from the gallows.'" So Johnson knew that he had certain alternatives and then certain other alternatives. He had a dear friend who wound up being hung, and he was himself terribly poor, and he didn't have lots of alternatives, and he had a master who beat him very well. We don't want to do that today, but excuse me, I'll disable this phone. It won't long interfere. There, see? So I mentioned that because sometimes life can be very rough, and yet we learn a whole lot from life if we're realistic in its approach. And if anyone developed habits, it was Dr. Johnson, pulling together the first real dictionary in the English language on almost no money whatsoever up in a garret. Involved incredible self-discipline. But if you want rants, read Johnson. He was a master of rants.
Okay.
All right, I go ahead and invite you, all of you, to reflect on the difference between time off and leisure. We oftentimes struggle for time off. Time off turns into a vacation, and the etymological roots of vacation, what's that? Emptiness, vacuity, as opposed to a holy day. And we don't talk about holy days. They're now only holidays. Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. I can't resist. So, you know, there's a wonderful essay by David Foster Wallace called On a Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. And he actually goes on a cruise, a deluxe carnival type cruise. And he's an ethnographer. He just kind of carefully observes what's going on and really paying attention to what's going on with himself. And really, I think it's just a great diagnosis of vacation, but a form of vacation that he really describes as a form of vegging out. I mean, that really is the ultimate telos or purpose of the cruise is just to be able to veg out, and he actually uses the word anesthetized. You just want to kind of just not have to think, not have to work, just have no toil whatsoever. And I think that is so tempting, at the end of a long day, to just screen up and screen down, and to veg out. And the kind of leisure that I think you're pointing to is not about vegging out. It's about restoring the self rather than vegging out the self. But it requires a bit more effort, and it requires partaking of practices that usually are embodied. I mean, this is a very simple practice, but instead of watching a screen for an evening, going for a 30-minute walk is a way that we can be restored. And reading a book that requires our attention. Pieper makes this distinction between two ways of knowing the world, drawing from Aquinas. The one is intellectus, from the Latin intellect meaning understanding, and the other is ratio, also from the Latin meaning reason. And our ratio mind tends to be active, engaged, it's critical, it's sizing things up. Our intellectus faculty, however, is contemplative, it's receptive, it's able to behold and just receive. And too often we neglect that faculty. And it's a tricky thing because it takes work not to work, to be people who are receptive and are capable of experiencing the beauty there is in a simple thing like going for a walk is the kind of restorative leisure that is distinctly different than the kind of vegging out options that are so easy and so tempting to choose.
May I jump in with a little
Yes,
question?
please.
So I'm human too. I know I have these tendencies as well. Kevin, do you think that there's a moral reason? Is there a dimension of morality against vegging out? And maybe a little bit, how serious is it?
That's a great question. Aristotle makes a distinction between amusement and leisure. And we tend to conflate the two. We tend to think of leisure as amusement. And Aristotle is saying, no, there's something very different going on here. And leisure is a way of beholding and seeing the world. And we talk about the beatific vision, that the great leisure, the great Sabbath that we all are going to partake of, and that requires cultivating this kind of seeing. Aristotle, describes amusement as a medicine. So there is a certain therapeutic relaxation that it provides. But like a medicine, you take it in small doses or reasonable doses. And instead, we tend to take too much NyQuil and just think that's the go-to thing for restoring myself. Is I need to find amusement. And so, yeah, I don't want to suggest that I'm this Spartan, person who never, I did watch the Super Bowl and I enjoyed it. I did think that last call was a bit questionable, however, but I did want Kansas City to win, but not that way. But again, our life can just be one long Super Bowl, in terms of all the media that's available to us. I mean, we remember a time when television stopped, at about 11 o'clock at night, it just stopped. And there was just a white, maybe an icon on the screen. And now it's just ceaseless, it's endless. And so the amusement industry, which is so good at drawing us in and captivating and holding us, takes up all the oxygen in the room, Stephanie. And our habits, you mentioned your habits of watching Judge Judy, when you think about the habits that our children today are picking up with respect to amusement, I think I'm going on a rant here now. It is
Good, go for it.
Yeah, it is deeply concerning. I mean, these children have been guinea pigs in this social media experiment in real time. We all are. I mean, we all are drawn in by this, but children.
My phone just randomly offers me something to buy something that I was talking about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So yeah. So I think it's the balance that is critical.
We're at the end of the hour. It happens all too soon. We always close with the gospel for the day, and this is from Mark. When Jesus and his disciples arrived at Bethsaida, people brought to him a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Putting spittle on his eyes, he laid his hands on the man and asked, "Do you see anything?" Looking up, the man replied, "I see people looking like trees and walking." Then he laid hands on the man's eyes a second time, and he saw clearly. His sight was restored, and he could see everything distinctly. Then he sent him home and said, "Do not even go into the village." Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much for joining us.
You,
Thank you.
for-
excellent.
Wonderful
For
to meet
having-
all of you.
Thank you.
Mario's been making up confetti for the parade. He's
I'm,
all
I'm
set.
going to the parade right now.
Wow, see? Take care.
All right.
Yeah, good.
Bye-bye.